Good evening. My name is Steve Jendrysik, and I'm more or less the unofficial historian of the city of Chicopee, Massachusetts. But today I'm going to be talking about a specific ethnic immigration to the valley and the impact they had on a small New England mill town, namely Chicopee, Massachusetts. The Poles, who arrived here in 1880, more or less a very small number, ended up actually staying for a short time at the Holy Name Rectory on South Street, and then were provided with some housing on Exchange Street by the Tulija family. And the pastor of Father Healy, the pastor of Holy Name, got them jobs at the mills. And they were the first to arrive here from Europe. Now, there are all sorts of stories about the mills, but one thing is certain. They were paid about $3 a day, and most of them actually immigrated from Galicia, which is in southern Poland, and were farmers. They were not trained in any type of industrial enterprise, and consequently, this was quite a change for them. But nonetheless, they adjusted to it slowly, and very quickly, additional Polish immigrants arrived. Without getting into the details of why they came right now, they obviously were unfamiliar with their surroundings, and there were only a small number of Poles in Chicopee at that time. So by 1882 or 1883, they had at least established themselves and were living in housing close to the mills. Now, these jobs were, of course, by their standards, enough to provide them with a relatively good, in fact, in some cases, more money than they had ever seen. But the important thing about this was that within the next decade, they would establish themselves. And the first reason, of course, is obvious. At that time in the United States, we had an open immigration policy, which was promoted by, at that time in the mid-90s, by President McKinley. And that policy, of course, was rather unique. And I think when you talk about these immigrant contributions, you have to get into one thing that even today is not the order of business in most parts of the world. When you arrive here in the United States, and of course, in many cases, you get married and have children here, the children have an extraordinary birthright. That first generation of Poles, first generation of Irish, first generation of French Canadians who came here were automatic citizens, birthright citizens of the United States of America. And as you well know, that is still true. It's very, very important to understand that. This makes the United States a very different destination for immigration. And by the 1890s, that immigration was growing in huge numbers because the American industrial system, the American system, was becoming the largest producer of industrial materials in the world by the year 1900. And there was a huge demand for labor. And that demand, of course, attracted people who also left their homeland for the usual reasons. And let's visit Galicia for a minute. It was the poorest of all the provinces of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And of course, it was grossly overpopulated. A simple reason. But that didn't necessarily mean people were going to come. But as always seems in Europe, there was war clouds were on the horizon, and the Austro-Hungarian Emperor and the Austro-Hungarian Empire was recruiting soldiers. In other words, drafting them. Conscription came to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and many of the young Poles, male Poles, got out of Galicia. The Austrian army, besides being the worst army perhaps in Europe in terms of training and so forth, was handicapped by the fact that The officers spoke German, and most of their provinces, especially Galicia, of course, which spoke Polish, didn't know what the officers were talking about. It wasn't a very good arrangement. So many of the young men would come to America. Now, they, of course, paid their way, and they borrowed the money. And many times they borrowed it from money lenders in Poland to make the trip. And, of course, they traveled by rail to Hamburg or German ports and got on American ships, which were delivering in many ways all sorts of materials to Europe. But most of the times you read about it, they got on cattle boats and headed for America. Well, some of this, of course, you want to wonder, why would they end up in a certain place? Well, once the people from Galicia got here, they started sending letters home and sending money home, and of course made this aid on this area, including all of western Massachusetts, was a target for immigration from Galicia. Now, obviously, you can get into numbers and so forth, but those numbers, of course, would grow tremendously after 1900. And many of them, in many cases my own family, they came here. When one brother came over, he brought over his two younger brothers. And of course, this was done working in the mills, making $2 to $3 a day. And you know, how did they do it? Well, they saved every possible penny to get them here. Then you come to one of those unacceptable facts for many historians. 50% of them went back. And that's the basic touchstone of my little talk today. The ones who stayed. Why did they stay, and why did the others go back? Well, part of it you often read, particularly in sociology explanations, the American lifestyle just didn't fit in. And obviously there were a lot of other reasons. They spoke a foreign language, they did not understand the customs of the country they were in, so forth and so on. But I often fall back on the simple explanation that they saved every penny they made, and they took the money back to Poland. And they took it back to buy land, many of them. Some went back because in the case of couples coming, if the husband wanted to go back or the wife wanted to go back, they went back. And this is true of almost all the Eastern Europe immigrants, with, of course, the exception of the Jewish immigrants from Russia and Eastern Europe, who did not intend to go back. And I think it's pretty obvious why they weren't going to go back. The situation was not very good, especially in Russian Poland. But the ones who stayed, who were they? Well, I like to think that they, in many cases, they were the younger ones who didn't have ties back in the old country. But they stayed, of course, because they fell in with the lifestyle. And that's the group we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about the entrepreneurial class, you know, as I said, from grocery stores to the stock market. These young fellows obviously fit right in with the lifestyle. And they brought many of the cultural aspects and, of course, their religion. In Poland, of course, and especially in Galicia, the second most powerful institution in that province of the Austro-Hungarian Empire after the emperor was the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church and Catholic priests tried to protect, and honestly, tried to protect these people from a very unpleasant situation in Poland. Russian Poland, that's what it meant. The Russians controlled half of Poland, the Germans the other half, or should I say the other third, and of course the Austro-Hungarians controlled the south. So these people lived in an area where they didn't really exist. There was no Polish government. So the solidest, the rock solidest thing in the country was the Roman Catholic Church. So when they came here, they established very quickly some fraternal organizations. The St. Stanislaus Society most raised over $2,000 to buy land to build a Catholic church. And again, to understand the development of the city of Chicopee, you've got to understand location. There were many churches were located in different segments of communities. But in this particular instance, they bought the land from Arthur Granfield, who was a real estate developer at the time, on Front Street, right in the middle of Front Street. In fact, so that the working Poles who lived in the Falls, Chicopee Falls, and worked at the Chicopee Manufacturing Company, and those that lived at the Dwight Mills, lived near the Dwight Mills in Chicopee Center, were able to go to one church. So there was no second church. The Catholic Church, of course, became very important. They were welcomed, the Catholics were welcomed by the Irish Catholics and the French Canadians, who were also Catholics and already had established their own churches. The church they would build would need a priest. And that's the first part of our story. The man who came was a man named Father Halupka. Father Halupka was the first ordained Pole, although he was actually Slovakian, was the first ordained priest in the Springfield Diocese. He was a very well-educated man, and his job was to be the shepherd for the Poles, and that meant building a church. And by 1895, they had built one, a very large wood-framed church on Front Street. Now that church, of course, would become the center of the Polish community. And of course, they would be very much directed to maintaining Polish culture, the Polish language, and the Polish way of life. Now this, of course, happens to many immigrant groups. They come from foreign places, and they want to retain their own cultural ties to the old country. But again, the Poles didn't even have a country at the time, which is very important to understand for the 50% or 60% that remained here. They, of course, weren't thinking about going back anytime soon. And they were, of course, very much enthralled with their new, shall we say, their new country. And that's the group I'm going to be talking about. Because when they got here, they bought into something that's so very important to the Polish mentality. Here's a group of people who never understood the real meaning of freedom. They tried. There were more rebellions in Poland than perhaps any other place in Eastern Europe. They rebelled against the Germans, against the Russians, against the Austro-Hungarians, rather unsuccessfully. What were they looking for? Well, a simple thing. And I, for 40 years here at Comp, I told the story of freedom. They just fell in love with freedom. The United States was a very unique place. The greatest single freedom showed up every 3 weeks or every 4 weeks. I believe every month, actually, they were paid on a monthly basis in their pay envelope. That money belonged to them. After living in a country which was run by almost, as I love to say, almost the Middle Ages, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, whose emperor at the time was a man named Franz Joseph, who was probably about in his 80s already, in a country which never existed. The Poles, of course, had one major connection, and that was with the Catholic Church. The Church here somewhat errs in trying to promote the Polish language and Polish culture because these people were already enamored with their new country. And what they were actually enamored with was owning their own business, owning their own land. These things became very much part of their DNA, if you will. They were going to do it. The other thing they were fascinated about, of course, was American politics. In 1896, we had a spectacular election between William Jennings Bryan and William McKinley, and they were fascinated by it. They had never experienced anything quite like American democracy firsthand. Of course, they weren't citizens yet, but the little arrivals that were coming on Exchange Street and West Street and Front Street, they were already American citizens. And that's something so very wonderful. That first generation of kids were going to be Americans. And as I said so often when I speak, they weren't going to look back. they were going to become Americans. Now, what that meant, of course, was working very hard, dealing with the new culture, and, of course, as so often happens, a very negative thing happened. Their first priest, Father Hołupka, ran into deep, deep trouble with part of the congregation. He was, of course, as I said, very bright man, very autocratic, but what got him into trouble was his personal habits. And without going into detail about what they were, 10 members of the parish immediately contacted the papal legate in Washington, D.C., demanding his removal. They did that after the bishop had, the Catholic bishop in Springfield, had really pretty much brushed them off with their complaints about his behavior. Well, what it led to was the legate, who was a representative of the Pope in Washington, D.C., requested that a special trial be held to air their grievances against Father Hołupka. Those grievances, of course, they would not be in attendance at that meeting, which was held in the Chicopee Polish Center, actually, the old rectory of Holy Name Church. Now, at that particular trial, it was a form of a trial, he spoke out, and his accusers were not allowed to present the case against him. Instead, they were invited in after the meeting with the investigated group and were told that he would be given a slap on the wrist and he would be returned to the parish. Well, the group of them, 10 of them, ended up on the front of the lawn on South Street, and they decided that they were going to contact a priest in Buffalo, New York, named Stephen Kaminsky, and they were going to establish their own church. Now, this is very unusual because only in America had this happened to immigrant groups on this level. These people who were establishing this new church, and it would be the Holy Mother of the Rosary Church on Bell Street, had already done some spade work and found out about these movements, but the church would, of course, be a Protestant version of the Catholic Church. And that Protestant version, of course, would be established as a competitor. And they bought land on Bell Street, which is off of Front Street, and built their wooden frame church and established their parish. Now, when they did that, of course, they appealed, obviously, to members of the Catholic Church and on Front Street. And, of course, some did join up with this new church. It's important to understand that many of the business-oriented Poles would eventually at least consider possibly joining the Catholic Church, the National Catholic Church on Bell Street. And this is going to go through all my little talk here today, because the two churches, obviously, Father Hołupka, rather strangely, and some of the church histories, we're not quite sure what happened to him, but he left, and the Franciscans, with the Father Stanislaus Saluzniak, were invited to take over the church, which already had a school and was moving toward establishing a plan to build a bigger church. So the Franciscans arrived in 1902. Now again, that's again a situation. The Franciscans are not secular priests. They're an order, and of course a Polish order of priests at the time, the St. Anthony, St. Anthony group of Catholic priests. So they took over managing the Chicopee parish. They also, of course, immediately put into motion a plan to expand the size of the school and to build a new church. And they built that new church beginning in 1908, and it was the largest Polish house of worship in the country at the time. That all went along fine, so we had established two churches in town as these Polish immigrants began to establish their businesses. Now, what kind of businesses are we talking about? Primarily grocery stores, butcher shops, bakeries, a few barber shops, small, what we would call small entrepreneurial efforts. But the one thing they did have, of course, was cash, because they operated their little stores on what they called the book. And people who were only paid on a monthly basis at the mills were able to buy on credit. That, of course, could be a situation where there would be difficulty in paying their bills, but for the most part, these men began their entrepreneurial careers in the grocery business. There were others who already started to buy land in considerable, and these people, of course, would become the more prominent ones. Down in Chicopee Center, obviously Peter Starzyk built a magnificent building, the Starzyk Building, right across from the City Hall. That building, of course, he started at the mills, working for $3 a day, and eventually bought himself what was basically a men's or haberdashery right on Center Street, and he started lending money. One of the reasons, of course, was that the Poles and others could not really borrow any money from the existing banks. The banks, with justification, didn't consider them very good risks. So Starzyk became a moneylender, a real estate developer, and, of course, what you would say the first really big success when he built his building the building was built in 1915. But these developments, of course, all occurred simply because more and more Polish immigrants were pouring into Chicopee. They were also pouring into Ludlow, Indian Orchard, and surrounding areas. These people, of course, would get jobs in the mills, and they would, they obviously spoke the Polish language. But what developed at that point was a very, very aggressive entrepreneurial class in Chicopee and in Chicopee Falls. And these fellows were expanding their business, they were buying real estate, and they were also advising the newcomers. Perhaps the most famous of them was a man named Felix Vertek, who also spent a great deal of time lending money and making travel arrangements for these immigrants' relatives so they could come to America. The Polish Center on South Street has all of his records, a fabulous collection, which are now being digitalized by the state of Massachusetts. He tells the story of this immigrant class who were coming to America in that decade, 1900 to 1910. Intriguing, though, with so many of them, of course, as I said, they were still turning back after they had made a stake and heading back to the old country. As the situation in Europe became more and more unstable, they were going back, many of them. And it's hard to imagine, in retrospect. But again, the young ones, especially now, the Austro-Hungarian army in Galicia was really starting to expand the number of troops because, as I said, there was trouble brewing between the Russians and the Germans, and the beginning of communism in parts of Europe and Russia. There were unstable times, but they returned to the old country. But there was still no Poland. They returned either to Galicia or Silesia, which was Russia, which was German Poland, or the Polish kingdom, which was where the Russians were in charge. They left here. But those who stayed, and I always like to talk about this, and historians call these events watersheds. Well, one of the watersheds occurred in 1910, the anniversary of the Battle of Grunwald. This was a great victory 400 years ago over the Teutonic Knights, the Germans, by Polish and Lithuanian troops at a place called Grunwald. Well, the newcomers, the Polish newcomers, decided that they wanted to celebrate the 400th anniversary of the Battle of Grunwald. And of course, they asked the city fathers and the mayor if they could have a parade. And the mayor at that time was a little doubtful about approving this thing when he got an idea as to the scope of that parade. There's a great picture of them, of course, on the steps of the City Hall, the parade committee, which was made up of members of both Chicopee Polish churches, and of course, rather interesting, they brought what do they call it, a chaplain, a Polish priest from outside the community, because both Polish churches were not really part of the planning of this event. This event was being actually planned by the business community and the veterans groups that existed. In other words, Polish immigrants who had served in the Austro-Hungarian or the German army for that matter, or even the Russian army, were now in town, and they were going to handle the marching units in this parade. And of course, finally they got approval to have the parade. And the parade would turn out to be, as I said, a watershed moment for them. They went out of their way. In this picture on the steps, they're there in their three-piece tailored suits, holding their cigars, and ready to carry out a spectacular community undertaking. That was the parade. 25,000 people showed up from other communities. It was a 3-day event. They planned, they provided lodging, they provided security, which led to a snarky comment in the paper I work for, the Springfield Republican, about the fact that there were only 5 arrests during the whole 3 days. The immigrants, of course, had taken their share of battering from the Springfield Republican. But that particular one, they admitted, it was an extraordinary event. As far as the different groups that participated, from then on, they were always getting invitations. Anytime there was a parade locally or anywhere in the region, that parade invited the Poles to march. Now, these developments, of course, had a little bit of an ominous notion about the behavior of some of these newcomers. They were organizing something that for some, and again, whenever I talk about this, it's hard to explain why the Catholic Church took such an odd stance according in its handling of this. Perhaps they were worried about these people. Perhaps it was legitimate motive. But I never felt that way. Obviously, these gentlemen who organized this fantastic parade also set the wheels in motion to build Polish national homes, one in each of the communities, one in Chicopee Center and one in Chicopee Falls. Now, today they've passed into history of their importance. But back then, they were a secular version of a very important function. They did not, they obviously recognized both churches, but the Polish National Home had a basic motivation. They wanted the members, number one, to be protected, so they sold insurance, and they also built a very large building, which was finally completed in 1914, right on Center Street, the Polish National Home. The one in the Falls came later. They were a social meeting place outside of the religious meeting places. They also, of course, were very much concerned about these newcomers becoming citizens. It was pretty much an expedient. If you were going into business, you'd better learn English and you had better become a citizen, because that was very, very important if you're going into business. And of course, it also meant that you could vote. And that was their basic concern. For some reason, of course, the Catholic Church was not really in favor of learning English, which says this, again, no matter all the reading I've done, it's amazing. They were fearful by learning the new language. They, of course, would give up their cultural heritage in many ways. And of course, they were right. There's no doubt about it. The next generation of Poles would be, of course, would be faithful for a while to the old language, but all of them, of course, would speak English. And that was because even the the parochial schools were concerned about their students being able to speak the language. And these two organizations, of course, followed by many others, as time went on, the large manufacturing facilities, particularly the mills, provided the time off for Polish and French-Canadian immigrants, particularly, to learn English. It actually connected with the public schools to begin teaching English right on the premises, because these newcomers, of course, were going into manufacturing jobs, which did need some serious, perhaps even in terms of getting out of the textile mills. If you went to work in the auto industry at Stevens Duryea or at the Fisk Tire Company, this involved some sophisticated machining, and they needed to speak English. And this is what happened. The country, though, wasn't quite ready for this kind of situation. And it would be unfair to say that there wasn't, tensions between the newcomers and between the native Protestant Americans. But nonetheless, the growth of this industry, of the industries in Chicopee, required so many workers that the minute you arrived, as they used to say in the old expression, off the boat, you had a job if it worked. And again, for other areas, which I'll speak about at the end of our little presentation, you, of course, also were able to pay your rent, you were able to find lodging, and you found a Polish community along with 2 Polish churches that were ready to welcome you to the new community. Of course, this sort of thing is easy to talk about, but of course there were tensions, there were problems, and they would exist all the way up to the outbreak of World War I, when obviously the Poles found themselves in a very unique position. They were hoping, that possibly Poland would be able to come back as a result of it, and their dream came true with the 14th of Wilson's 14 points. President Wilson was freedom for Poland. And if you visit Warsaw today, there is still a large monument to an American president. The 14th Amendment, the 14th of the points, and part of the League of Nations document was freedom for Poland. And so many Poles were very much interested in what was going on in Europe. But as aliens, they could not join the American Army in 1917 when we went to war. Although Chicopee's largest public park is named for Frank J. Zott, who actually was killed in the war and was a Polish immigrant, was actually the son of a Polish immigrant, and he was a citizen, and he did die in the war. But the Poles were fighting in Europe against the Germans, and they were fighting in a volunteer army in France. It was called the Blue Army, and it was led by a Polish general, and he actually fought under Marshal Foch, the French commander. And of course, they were recruiting in the United States. And once again, the Polish business community stepped up. They were the ones who began raising money to send the Blue Army to fight in Poland, to fight for Poland. They would later go to Poland and fight the Russian communists and establish the Polish nation in 1921. But the Poles who left here were an interesting group of young men volunteering to fight for freedom for their home country in the war. The Blue Army, of course, many of them would return to the United States in the 1920s, but the new country of Poland was going to be part of the achievement of several units of American soldiers who actually went to fight in France against the Germans. And that group, of course, is kind of famous in this region, because there were many of the Blue Army members lived in Chicopee, Holyoke, Thompsonville, Ludlow, and places like that, and did go off to war. But the raising of funds for the Blue Army was a major achievement of several fund drives directed by the Polish business community to help the Blue Army, especially the military and you know, the needs in terms of paying for treatment in hospitals and so forth for the wounded. They stepped right up. And of course, again, they became organized. And one of the things that was an offshoot of that was the Polish National Credit Union, which was established in 1921 and is celebrating its anniversary, its 100th anniversary this year. The Polish Credit Union, of course, was the first Polish bank in the region, and it was the work of a number of Poles, especially Felix Fertek, who I mentioned earlier, who became the first president of the bank. This effort, of course, was something that was very unusual. They had established a bank, not just a bank, but a first in Western Massachusetts, and they had a difficult time getting their charter. They operated in a small corner of Mr. Fertek's real estate office on Exchange Street. But the bank had arrived, and of course it was important. That didn't mean that Poles weren't borrowed by then. Poles were borrowing money in several in regular banks, in the savings banks and in the commercial banks of the area, because they were slowly establishing themselves. Several companies, of course, and perhaps the Chicopee Provision Company and Yannick's Kielbasa and others were the first to actually secure loans from commercial institutions because their businesses were quite successful. But for the most part, the Polish Credit Union was dealing with home ownership. They were providing home loans and mortgages to Americans of Polish descent who were building their homes and buying homes. They were becoming, of course, the other thing, obviously, was politics. And when you start talking about politics, you get into a very interesting situation. Because there were two large immigrant communities in Western Massachusetts at that time, arriving the French Canadians who had arrived in the latter part of the 19th century, and the Poles from there, and of course in other parts of Western Massachusetts, the Italians arriving in large numbers and the Greeks. All were arriving in this area because of the economic booms. They also, of course, the war had involved so many different political viewpoints. The Irish, on the other hand, weren't too keen on supporting the British. And the Greeks, of course, were looking to independence for Greece. And, of course, the Italians were in and out of the war on both sides. It was a situation where the communities in Western Massachusetts were part of the war. When the war ended, of course, there was a reaction, a very serious reaction to immigration in general. Now, without getting into detail, they began to restrict immigration to the United States in the 1920s. That restriction, of course, came just about the time that the Polish Republic was formed back in the old country. And there were some Poles from Chicopee that returned to Poland now that it was a free country and it existed. But those numbers were pretty small. More will consider it during the Great Depression. But for the most part, by the 1920s, and you hear everybody's heard so much about the 1920s, which is probably the most overhyped period in American history. But nonetheless, Prohibition arrived, and that put another wrinkle on the ethnic communities. The Italians, the Greeks, the Poles, and the Irish, of course, were all from Europe. They, of course, enjoyed libations in large amounts prior to Prohibition. When Prohibition hit, many of those groups, of course, were caught in the middle of the Volstead Act, which made making and selling alcohol a crime in the United States. Most of them, and this goes for most ethnic groups, they didn't really understand that idea, and they weren't in favor of it. While the causes of the vote to go dry as a nation perhaps was not understood by them, because many of them, of course, weren't able to vote yet. But nonetheless, that development led to even some entrepreneurial operatives going into the illicit liquor business, and with kitchen rackets and picnics in obscure places, and of course dealing with violations of the revenue laws. But that was probably not so much as significant as the development of widespread neighborhoods with stores, facilities, and of course the advancement in terms of plumbing, electricity, and so forth led to electricians and all sorts of businesses for newcomers. And of course, the understanding that those newcomers, could use a little helping hand from the existing. So if you called up and you had a plugged sewer or something, you usually called a Polish plumber. By the 1920s, they were already making inroads into that, while the French-Canadian community, of course, was moving in the same direction in terms of construction jobs and so forth. They were moving to the next level. Now that meant that there was an influx of considerable funds for investments. And of course, in the 1920s, these people discovered the stock market. And of course, if you know your history, the stock market was booming in the 1920s, and so was investment in the 1920s. That investment, of course, was coming from a lot of these people who owned their own individual businesses and had money to invest. Now, they'd become capitalists, but more than that, they had become very much part of the American fabric. Now, what's going to happen next, of course, is the collapse of the economy in the Great Depression. Now, the Great Depression would hit Chicopee with almost a massive body blow. When the Chicopee Manufacturing Company cut part of its operations, when the Dwight Mills and Chicopee Center actually just moved. They moved to Alabama. The company closed up, and 1,400 people lost their jobs. So the Depression hit Chicopee 2 years before 1929. Now this, again, would change the situation for many. The church, of course, modified its view, and actually the Catholic Church on Front Street urged the citizens to all become get their citizenship, because they were fearful they might lose their jobs if they weren't citizens. But for the most part, they were hard hit by the Depression, and of course that meant somewhat of a more active role in politics. And that again brings up a rather unique thing about this region. The people who became involved in politics oftentimes as members of lesser things like school boards and later the Board of Aldermen, or even these groups, of course, often lived in small areas and, of course, were represented by their own ethnic representation. In Chicopee, that ethnic representation between French Canadians and Poles became a major story. Ethnic politics were born, and they made up about between them, they made up well over 70% of the community, which of course meant that they finally, the French were the first to realize that if they joined together, they might be able to win the big job as mayor of the city. And they did. And of course, the Poles, watching, organized their group, so the Polish Americans and the French Canadians became an unofficial political party. There were no Democratic and Republican candidates because it was a nonpartisan election. And that became some of the most colorful political campaigns perhaps in the history of the region. And of course, in 1931, the election of a man named Tony Stonina, who actually was an auto dealer. He had come to the city in the 1920s from Northampton. He had come from the old country, from Poland, and he went into the automobile business. But by 1931, he was quite successful on Exchange Street, and of course he'd entered politics as an alderman. In 1931, he won the office in a very close election. And of course, it was not the best time to be elected mayor. From an economic standpoint, the country and the city was in horrible shape. When Tony Stonina became mayor, 1/3 of the city's workforce was out of work. And of course, he had to float a big loan from a Boston bank to keep the city running. The Shawmut Bank in Boston actually lent him the money. And his first 2 years were pretty rocky, and he lost his re-election bid. And the election, of course, was with Omar DeRoy, was elected in 1933. But the Stonina was back in 1935, and he won again in 1937. And so for probably the extent of the 1930s, we had a Polish mayor in Chicopee. We also had about, just imagine, every sort of business with ethnic representation. Everything, as I said, but now by the 1930s, in small numbers, they were joined by dentists, doctors, pharmacists who were of Polish extraction, and of course, the Poles were loyal to them. Your egg man, your bread man, were all Poles, and they were in business for themselves, and they were doing quite well. As I said, they had entered politics. But again, another interesting aspect of this time, the dominant party in the state of Massachusetts was the Republicans. And of course, the Republican Party welcomed Polish businessmen. It was the party of business, and most of them signed up and became active supporters of Republican candidates at the state and local level. That, of course, by the early 1930s had changed on the national level, because most of the people who worked at the mills and who were blue-collar workers, both French Canadians and Poles for that matter, were Democrats. They supported Franklin Roosevelt. So you had a situation where, in terms of local elections, they voted their nationality, but in the national election, they voted for the Democrats. Now, politics, of course, notwithstanding, there's a very famous picture of the last meeting, shall we say, in front of the Chicopee High School for all the Stonina, people who worked for Stonina and the municipal offices and so forth. It took time to take a picture. But by then, Mr. Stonina, who was less than popular even in the Polish community, would lose the 1939 election, and a French-Canadian candidate, Seneca, would become the mayor in 1940. But the years from 1880 to 1940, the Poles was a dramatic rise for an immigrant group. Since then, there have been major changes. There have been 2 additional Polish migrations to western Massachusetts, one after World War II by a group, the displaced Poles who had been slave laborers in Germany. Many of them were unable to go back to Poland after the war because of the communist takeover, and they came to western Massachusetts. They came to Chicopee, and today many of them are very successful here in business. And of course, back in the 90s, the Solidarity movement, which led to many Poles fleeing after the crushing of Solidarity in the 90s, was another immigration, another level of immigration to the United States and to Chicopee by the Poles. But these, of course, have all, again, they have, the result has been the same. These newcomers, of course, their children, have become Americanized. Now, today, in this country, the 7th largest ethnic minority, the Poles, are the 7th richest minority in this country. Now, they have succeeded. There are many reasons for this, and as I spoke earlier, in 2018, the Springfield Republican produced an extraordinary document. It's the story of the Polish community in this valley, from Pittsfield to Palmer, or from Palmer to Pittsfield. It's the story of the Poles who have succeeded in surrounding communities, many who did not come here did not come here to work in factories. They came to work in the fields, in the tobacco fields, and a decade later, a generation later, they bought the tobacco fields of Hadley and Hatfield and Northampton and all the way south to Ellington, Connecticut. As I used to tell my students, the only thing that changed was the mailbox, because the Polish names were much longer than the Yankee names. But they're still here as you travel the valley. So the Poles have a real presence here. But that presence, of course, and why it's still tremendously part of the valley, was what I said at the beginning. Why did they come here? They came basically for freedom. Now, back in 2005, my little book, I spent a good deal of time explaining their commitment to freedom. And we can talk about Kosciuszko and Pulaski and the Revolutionary War. But the Poles of Eastern Europe, the new Polish nation, is perhaps the staunchest ally the United States has in the region. The Poles are fascinated by Americans. And when we visited Poland, my wife and I, that was the first thing. They were having an election, and in a country which hadn't had a free election for many decades, of course, now was enjoying free elections. And of course, the only thing in Poland, they've had about 9 or 10 political parties. They hadn't gotten it down. So when we were visiting, the election was on, and we were interviewed a couple of times interviewed by newspaper people and asking us what we thought about the election. But of course, as I said, when the Poles finally got here at the turn of the 20th century, one of the first things they got involved in was politics and, of course, business. They became very much Americanized. And that's what I'm so proud of as an American of Polish descent, that we have become part of the fabric, as have so many other ethnic groups. We're not a minority anymore. We are Americanized. And that, of course, is something that's so very important. And, as I said, the opportunity, that opportunity that was presented to my grandparents, and for many of you in the audience, your great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents, was unheard of. They came to the country that was, without a doubt, very unique. It still is. But the uniqueness of it was freedom. Thank you.